We have two great speakers that I think you're really going to enjoy. If you don't know much about the environmental work that we do, make sure that you're going to WashingtonPolicy.org to look at our blog. There's a lot that's going to go on with regard to the governor's climate policy. Water quality, you'll hear some about that today, a variety of other issues that are top on his agenda for the legislative session, and we blog on those issues on a regular basis, so you can see what's going on in Olympia and hear a different perspective on how we should deal with the environment. My other colleagues also blog there too. Their blogs are almost nearly as good as mine, but you can follow what's going on literally day to day in the session from the various folks that we have at the Policy Center at WashingtonPolicy.org. So before I introduce our two speakers, I want to talk a little bit about the approach that we advocate at the Washington Policy Center to help the environment. One of the things that I say when I get out and speak is, because I live in the Seattle area, I say that the farther you get from the environmentalists, the closer you get to the environment. Because the environmentalists tend to live and have chosen to congregate where concrete predominates. And folks who tend to support free market approaches more tend to move out to where there are trees and pastures and rivers and the environment. And the challenge that I have both with dealing with the environmentalists is to have them understand that they do not have all of the information about what is good for the environment and natural resources. But it's also important for folks who believe in the free market to say publicly what they live privately, which is that they care about the environment and they want to protect it. Because so often I think that the fight that ends up happening is that some issue will be raised and folks who are concerned about the cost of bureaucracy and government solutions sound like they don't care about the environment. And rather than doing that, what we need to do is to do an alternative approach, which is to say, we care about the environment, that's why we live near it, but there's a better way to preserve it rather than just creating another government agency. And that tends to be what we do. Every time there's an environmental problem, who are you going to call? You call a bureaucracy. You come up with a new government agency, and that's the way that we do this right now. So the governor has just released his cap-and-trade legislation on climate policy, and more than 40 times in his piece of legislation it says, the Department of Ecology shall. It gives all the power to the Department of Ecology in a whole range of areas: adopt by rule, distribute allowances, engage a qualified independent contractor, a financial services administrator, adopt an auction floor price, all these sorts of things. So if you're a legislator and you're trying to determine what does this mean in the real world, you can't tell. Because what they tell you is the department will figure that out later. Hand all the control to the Department of Ecology and it will work out. We've seen this, and I'm sure Brandon will talk about it, with water quality as well, where he's simply advocating handing over control to the department of a whole range of chemicals that they're concerned about. There's a better way to do it, though. The left always puts the worst solution first, which is regulation. Regulation is the most expensive and least effective, and that's just as important. When you care about the environment, you have to be effective, and regulation is often the least effective approach to helping the environment. There are 3 phases that you go through to help the environment that are more effective and less cost to do the same thing. The first is that you start with a property rights and cooperative solution. Second, if that doesn't work, you can go to sort of a market-based price solution. And then third, you can go to regulation. Regulation is not always bad, but it is the least effective and most expensive. And I put this chart up here because I'm a beekeeper, and I'm now obliged by law to always mention honeybees every time I speak. You've heard a lot about colony collapse disorder, where honeybees are dying and people don't know why. So what's interesting is that what people don't tell you is that actually the trend is good. That the percentage of hives that are dying has been going down basically every year since 2007. And the question is, what government agency made this happen? No government agency made this happen. Beekeepers made this happen, because if your bees die, you don't make money. And so the best solutions come from the people who are on the ground, and that's the free market approach that we advocate. So let me just tell you a little bit about sort of the 3 steps of how we think that you should go about solving environmental problems. The first is that you start with a property rights and cooperative solution. So Elinor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics, went around the world and looked at how cooperative solutions solve what are called tragedies of the commons, right? Where there's no property rights, all the fish in the sea, right? If you don't catch the fish, you try to save it for next year. Is that fish going to be there next year? No, the boat is behind you is going to catch it. So how do you solve that? And so what she found was that cooperative solutions where the people who were involved in a resource issue get together and come up with something that's unique to them, they're more durable and they're more effective. Because people are bought in, right? You don't have an agency or somebody outside trying to regulate and police. You have all the members looking out for each other. They know the tricks. They know how to police each other. And they're all committed to a solution. And she found that they're significantly more effective. Property rights can be a part of that, and there's a good example of that in Alaska, where all of the boats, all the fishing boats and the groundfish fishery each get a share of the total catch that's allocated each year. And rather than, what used to be good for reality TV is when they would all go out for 3 days and fish like crazy in horrible weather, people would die, boats would sink, and they would catch a huge amount of fish that they weren't supposed to catch. Because the nets they had were designed to catch everything you could as fast as you could. They changed that. They said, you can go catch this amount of fish anytime you want. It is your property right. And in fact, if you don't catch it, you can sell it to another boat who needs it. And you can sell it that way. And so it's a property rights approach. And so what the chart there is what's called bycatch, the number of fish that they're not allowed to catch that they're catching. And you can see that the percentages are actually declining. Once they put in a property rights and they could focus not just on catching as many fish as they could, but catching the right fish, the waste, the bycatch went down. Okay? I have to say, even high school students understood this. I taught a high school class about environmental policy, and I gave them all fish and said, whoever gets the most fish wins. And I said there'll be 3 rounds. And in the first round, everybody just took 1 fish. I said, why did you do that? You should catch as many fish as you want. But they were all watching each other. And they all knew, well, if there's more fish, then I told them each round I would add more fish to double the population. So they took 1 round. So they took 1 fish. What that shows is that when there are people who are working together in a cooperative solution, they can be responsible because they know each other and they can enforce it. And it was an amazing example of even high school students showing what Elinor Ostrom understood. That doesn't always work. Sometimes there are too many people, right? There's only a limited number of boats, but if you have pollution that is by a lot of people but very small increments, then that property rights and cooperative solution doesn't always work. So you can turn to this, which is a more market-based. And it's more of a Milton Friedman approach. So Milton Friedman says that you put a price on the impact that you cause. And the example he gave was national parks. So if a national park has an entrance, has an access point, you charge the people who come into the park for the damage they cause to the park, rather than charging everybody, right? It's essentially a user fee. So that's the approach that he says that they should do with national parks. We've done this also with ozone-depleting chemicals. We put a price on CFCs, and the first Bush administration added this excise tax to CFCs, and what you can see there is the chart that some of the CFCs, some of the ozone-depleting chemicals leveled, but some of them went down. It was because there was a large number of organizations who were using the CFCs. You couldn't do the cooperative approach, so they put a price on it, and guess what? They found alternatives. So that's the second way that you'd do it, right? It's not necessarily as good as the property rights or the cooperative approach, but it's the second best way. And then third, you get to a regulatory approach. And like I said, this is often the most expensive and least effective way to do things. The EPA, going through its process of dealing with coal plants, They openly admit that it is the worst way to reduce carbon emissions. In fact, they even argued that and said, we would rather that you adopt other climate policies because this is so expensive and ineffective. Right? They used its ineffectiveness as a lever against Congress to try to get a different policy. But it's not always a bad idea. Let me just give you two examples. Nationally, unleaded gasoline, we saw that there was a lot of lead in the air. And so they moved from leaded to unleaded gasoline. It was a fairly simple switch, and you can see that it dramatically reduced the amount of lead in the atmosphere. Okay? In Washington State, we banned copper brake pads. They did research finding that the small bits of copper brake dust that come off of your pads get washed into the water, and then salmon, it messes with their sensory system, and when there's danger, they put out an alert pheromone that other salmon can smell. They couldn't smell it anymore because of the copper brake pads. So there were other brake pads available. It wasn't a high cost, so they said, we're going to get rid of copper brake pads. Okay? It's not zero cost, but it was better than the other ways to do it. Okay? That is the way that we should approach environmental policies. Start with a cooperative and a property rights approach and work down. Now, all of this assumes, of course, a lot of the fights that we get with the environment are people say, we need to protect X or Y, or we need to reduce this amount of risk. And other people say, that's not a risk at all. So I'm setting aside the fight that often goes on about whether we're actually facing environmental problems in this area or that area. But when everybody agrees that this is an environmental problem, putting pollution, putting sewage into a river, the question is, how do you deal with it? And this is the process that those of us in the free market go through. It is more effective and less expensive to do it that way. Right? And so, with that, this is my exhortation to you. Like I said, we live these values privately because we live near the forests, we live near pastures, we work with natural resources, and we ought to say how much we care about the environment. And so I would just discourage folks. Too often the way that folks on the right fight the environmental community is to say that's not a problem. But I can tell you that some of the best conversations I've ever had about fishing, I spoke to a group that was a Tea Party group, and I had a guy come up to me afterwards and talked about marine reserves and other fishing issues and overfishing. And I was laughing in my mind because I know that the environmental community would think it would be crazy that I would ever talk to the Tea Party, and yet this guy was saying almost identical things to some folks in the environmental community that I talked to. He cared very deeply about fishing. We hike, we hunt, we fish, we care about the environment. We should say it. And if we follow these rules, we can do it in a way that is more effective and is consistent with our values. So that's the sort of stuff that we write about at the Washington Policy Center. I'll wave this at you. That way is not the way we do it at Washington State. Right? We do a regulatory approach, a very expensive approach, and the way that we do it, we often focus more on how we feel, how it makes us feel, than whether it actually helps the environment. And so we did a study about 5 years ago called 5 Years of Environmental Policy in Washington State. Are we making a difference? The environmental community had this agenda every year for 5 years, and so we looked at how effective their agenda was, and we found that in many cases, the environmental policies that we followed actually did more harm to the environment than good, because the goal was to make us feel good. All right. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker, John Charles. He is the president of the Cascade Policy Institute, where you have been for 16 years?
18.
18 years now. For 15 years, before that, he was head of the Oregon Environmental Council. So he has had experience on both sides of this issue from the left and the right, and has wonderful stories to talk about his experiences and what he's learned as a result of that. I think he's one of the best speakers in understanding environmental policy and where we are today, and especially from Oregon, and he can share the problems that they've had. Please welcome John Charles.
Thanks, Todd. He didn't mention I also spent 2.5 years working for Environmental Defense Fund in New York City. That's where I started my career. So I spent 20 years of my career in the belly of the beast in the mainstream left-wing environmental movement. And now the last 18 years with the Cascade Policy Institute, so I think I have a decent perspective on how people think in different parts of the political spectrum. Todd asked me this morning to talk about green jobs, whatever that means. And since this is a solutions summit, you might ask, well, are green jobs the solution to some problem? And I would say not really, because the phrase green jobs doesn't mean anything. It's a totally vacuous phrase that can't be defined for many reasons. One is life cycle analysis. It's something that may appear in a brief moment of time to be environmentally progressive or sustainable. At first blush, it may not be if you actually look at it in a broader context. Given this part of where we are in the state, or a little south of here across the river in Oregon, you can drive around and find a lot of windmills, and the industrial wind industry is certainly considered among my former environmental colleagues to be a green industry, and yet I would argue that it's not. I mean, the fuel, the wind blowing, is, okay, that's sustainable. Sure, it's free, nice price, but it's completely unreliable. And it has to feed electricity into a grid. There's a commercial system here. And we don't just run the lights and the power system here on randomly failing wind and solar. You know, and the grid itself has to have supply and demand in equilibrium 100% of the time. The voltage has to be in complete equilibrium. So when you're running a grid system, you're one of those people sitting in some windowless back office surrounded by computer screens making sure that this all works. Well, something that fails to produce power randomly about 80% of the time, okay, the fuel's free. Well, so what? That's not very reliable. That's about as useful as saying there's no shortage of water on the planet because we have so many oceans. Sure, if you don't mind the salt in the water, and it's not going to help you with drinking, I guess that's true. And so the fact that the wind is free and renewable isn't really helpful. Plus, you have to ignore all the bird kills, migratory birds that are slaughtered by wind operators. And then there's the environmental effects of the spinning reserve. What's spinning reserve? Well, that's the backup, because we're running a grid, and the grid needs to have power all the time. So every time you bring on X amount of power from a wind, you have to have virtually the same amount of power backing it up that you can deploy on a moment's notice for the randomly failing part of the wind. So in this particular region, it's been the hydro system that is the spinning reserve, but that's increasingly tapped out. So now we're moving to natural gas combined cycle turbines, and there's also a product known as renewable energy certificates. These are marketable commodities, and each REC, as they're known, represents the so-called environmental amenities associated with a megawatt hour of green power. And when you call up the people who buy and sell these RECs and say, well, does this box of environmental amenities, which is a completely fictitious thing that I'm buying, does that account for the backup power from this natural gas turbine? The answer is no. Okay, so the people who buy and sell RECs, they think they have this halo over their head. They're in the green power business. And the people who build and sell wind power, they think they have a green halo. Okay, but no one's accounting for the environmental impacts of the backup source, which in some places like Colorado, it's actually coal plants that are ramped up and down like a yo-yo, which makes all their pollution control equipment work much worse than ordinary. So there's this, when you look at this systemically, a life cycle analysis, you can see that the notion that the wind energy is unequivocally some kind of green jobs program is simply false. In addition to the fact that without boatloads of subsidies, including the REC industry is just a way of generating money, since there's the people in the business sell power here, and then they can sell RECs over here, representing the so-called environmental amenities of this power. It's just a way of sending more money to them. Without subsidies, the industry doesn't exist. Well, if everybody needs subsidized all the time, that's not a sustainable business model. Another example, Portland for the last 25 years has had a ban on polystyrene foam products in coffee shops and to-go restaurants. So if you go to downtown Portland, you walk into Starbucks, you can't get a really functional styrofoam or polystyrene foam cup that actually works really great as an insulator. No, 25 years ago, they decided it would be greener to force people to use paper cups. So now you go in and you get an automatic double cup without asking for it, because paper is a terrible insulator. You get a double paper cup plus a Java jacket, a cardboard thing. Okay, now you have 3 things to throw away. Before, you had a polystyrene foam cup, which is about 95% air, and you can actually recycle them. You can't recycle the paper cups, so you have more litter. We did two papers on this in the last 20 years, showing that from a life cycle standpoint, the ban on foam cups was basically led to more water pollution, more air pollution, more energy consumption. It was kind of the trifecta of policy stupidity, and yet Portland politicians, their arrogance in promoting this was stunning. They had it exactly backwards. But I've brought this up with Portland policymakers, but and their view is now, John, it's too late. It's over. We have our story. We're sticking with it. It's a great program. Yeah, okay, sure. Okay, well, another problem is cultural values change. 100 years ago, if you wanted to protect salmon from sea lions that chomp on them all the time, you could kill sea lions and get a $5 bounty from the state of Oregon. Well, if you go down to the Bonneville Dam now, where the sea lions are lined up for their daily buffet of salmon, and get out your deer rifle and pick off a few sea lions, you're not going to get a $5 bounty from the state. No, I think the black helicopters will be landing soon, and you'll be taken out to jail because cultural values have changed. The same is true with all the spotted owls that we thought we were protecting in the Northwest, but gee, now they're getting pushed into extinction through barred owls, so now we're going to pay to kill thousands of barred owls because they're predating on spotted owls. Well, who's wearing the green hat there? You can make a lot of money killing pike minnows in the Columbia. That's kind of the sea lions version of today. The top earner last year in the bounty system we have earned $73,698 last year killing pike minnows, because we have this artificial construct that salmon good, pike minnows bad. Well, why is that? There's nothing in nature that says that's the case. If we started to raise school kids to say that in school, well, pike minnows are wonderful and salmon are just, kind of a trash fish, you could do the reverse. Nature itself doesn't really care. And yet we spent, in 2013, over $1 million to 874 anglers who killed 160,000 pike minnows because we have in our mind salmon good, pike minnows bad. Well, 100 years ago, we thought, salmon good and sea lions bad. Just depends on what era you're talking about. The other is we have a real knowledge problem. I mentioned it in the polystyrene foam issue. One of my most interesting stories about this, I think, is the way cholera epidemics were viewed in the 19th century, which is that medical experts were convinced that cholera was transmitted through a miasma, as they called it, miasma of airborne poisons associated with private cesspools, population density, and animal waste. Because you remember, cities were densely populated with animals and people, and they really smelled terrible. And there were many cholera outbreaks in London. And Edwin Chadwick, who later came to be known as the father of modern public health movement, was a key promoter in the miasma theory. He wanted the cesspools drained directly into the Thames River, which is where most Londoners got their drinking water. So under Chadwick's orders, London began sewering in the 1840s, which sewering might be thought of as a good thing. Well, all this did was contaminate the drinking water and kill off a thriving salmon fishery. And it also worsened the cholera problem. Each extension of the sewer system was followed by increasingly intense outbreaks of cholera. By the end of one outbreak, 15,000 Londoners were dead. So Stephen Johnson, in his book, The Ghost Map, which describes this in some detail, he says, quote, "The first defining act of a modern centralized public health authority run by, quote, experts was to poison an entire urban population." Well, for more than 30 years, the medical establishment insisted that cholera was an airborne disease, not a waterborne disease, even though there was evidence. Actually, a guy named Dr. John Snow was a private practitioner. He published a paper suggesting it was waterborne. And the medical establishment continued to cling to this miasma theory. I'll just kind of close down by saying, with regard to a lot of the comments that you hear today in regard to global warming or transit funding, about why you shouldn't question them, this is what he talks about with regard to that era. He says, so often what is lacking in many of these explanations and prescriptions is some measure of humility, some sense that the theory being put forward is still unproven. It's not just that the authorities of the day were wrong about miasma. It's the tenacious, unquestioning way they went about being wrong. So eventually, 15 years after Dr. Snow's death, he was eventually proven to be correct, and the medical establishment had to admit that they were wrong and he was right. But of course, he was dead, so there was no satisfaction for him. And I think in the context of the green job discussion, I just say, if you look at the last 100 years of pollution intensity of the economy, that is units of pollution per unit of GDP, it's been a huge success story going down. The same with energy intensity. We're twice as efficient now as an economy as we were 60 years ago. And it's not because of environmental regulations or mandates, it's because of competition and the invisible hand of the market. And I think we don't want governments picking winners and losers. We want a level playing field. And the cleanup of the environment is a big success story, largely because of markets, not because of regulation. Thank you.
All right, next up is Brandon Houskeeper. Brandon is the head of environmental policy for the Association of Washington Business. He is a hard guy to get a hold of during the session because there's a lot of environmental policy that goes on. He's going to talk specifically about water quality and the water quality issues that you're going to hear in this session. Let me just say one other thing. He has a good pedigree. He used to work at the Washington Policy Center. Please welcome Brandon Houskeeper.
I was going to try and make it through today without mentioning that I worked for the Policy Center, but since Todd brought it up, I was actually disappointed to come today. Normally, I worked with Todd for 4 years, and I heard a joke that he told many times over and over and over, and so I'm shocked we didn't get it today. So the joke was about Choku Charlie's in Alaska and the sign they had on the door or the wall or something. And I always thought that's a great story. It's a great joke, Todd. It helps tell what. And then I actually met a guy just about 2 months ago who started talking about Choku Charlie's and how they screwed the other guy and passed the savings on to you. I was like, wow, all this time Todd was telling the truth, and thought it was just some made-up story. So my apologies, Todd. I get a little bit nervous when I see one of the state's budget writers walk into the room because I'm trained as a lobbyist in Olympia. I'm trained to, when I see certain individuals or I'm going to testify, I know instantly just by their expression I better cut this down to 30 seconds and I better not repeat what has been said before. And then I get really nervous when I look behind him and see Senator Honeyford in the room. Because in my notes, I was going to say something nice about the governor and some work that we've been doing. So I'm just not in a good spot today. So we're here to talk about solutions, and I think that there's a good example of some things that are going on in Olympia. But there's also some challenges. And so I'm going to talk about a water quality issue that is turning into a conversation in Olympia about toxics reductions. And I think it ties nicely into the climate debate that was mentioned in the transportation session, as well as Todd briefly mentioned. And I won't go into the climate other than I think that there's a pathway on the water quality work that we've been doing that I'm hopeful the governor and other legislators in Olympia will help us with in having the debate on climate. And I think it fits in nicely with what Todd was talking about when he kicked off this session, talking about ways to solve the environmental problems and the steps that we should be taking in order to find solutions. And when do you turn to regulation, or when do you let the market drive what we're able to do and get results? So let me just run through a couple quick things, and then frankly I enjoy the question and answer session more, so I'll try and keep this real short. So I'm going to talk about water quality standards. Most people have no clue what I'm talking about if I talk about human health water quality criteria. I was running through a bunch of old information, just kind of getting myself back up to speed because we haven't been dealing with the issue as much the past couple months. And I realized I've been working on this issue for more than 3 years. I've sat through something like 7 different policy forums with the Department of Ecology. I was served at the governor's kitchen table on water quality, human health water quality. Bottom line is most people will say, oh, okay, now I know what you're talking about when I say it's the fish consumption issue. We try and avoid calling it that because it's about so much more than just fish and how much fish people eat. But that's the issue that most people know it by. I want to paint a quick picture for you. There used to be a time in our country back in the early 70s when we had problems. Rivers were catching on fire. Right? We know the real life story of Aaron Brockovich and the pollution problems that were going on. And so somehow we clearly missed the mark that Todd talked about of how we need to do proper assessment through property rights and marketplace. And there was a need. There was a clear need for regulation, for intervention. And so we got the Clean Water Act in the early 70s. The National Clean Water Act, the state of Washington followed suit, adopted their own Clean Water Act. There's some nuanced differences. They dealt with things just a little bit differently. But nonetheless, there certainly was a time when regulation through the Clean Water Act was necessary. We needed to do something different than we were doing it because it was evident when you have rivers catching on fire, you're doing something wrong. So moving forward, if we fast forward to today, I don't think we do a good job talking about it and telling the story. In fact, I think it's one of the greatest failures of the Puget Sound Partnership is they don't tell a good story. Instead, they talk about the negatives and the dying Puget Sound and the waters beneath and how it's pristine on top but dying underneath. But data actually shows that the water's getting cleaner, right? We can show that our environment is getting better. It's getting more healthy. And I think that if we focused more on the positives of what we're doing and ask the questions of what are we doing well, that we would actually be able to build on those successes and have better results long term. And I could give a plethora of examples of things that we've done right through some of those examples that Todd gave of property rights or the marketplace, and in some cases regulation has certainly played a role. Clean Water Act played a role in helping people clean up their act and reduce the pollution, the amount of pollution that they were putting into our waterways. When you start out, though, in 1970 and you move to today, it's rather easy to get some low-hanging fruit and pick at those things that where we really needed to make a change. But when we fast forward today and we say, okay, we're in a better spot, but we still want to regulate using the same tools that we developed in 1970. So using that tool, it came time for Washington State to update their water quality standards, and we've been going through that process for some time. We were able to sit down with a broad group of stakeholders, AWB, the cities, the counties, the ports. We sat down at length with the tribes, the environmental community, all the different stakeholders that care about this issue. And we were able to talk about the different solutions and opportunities that were out there. We were able to sit with the governor and the Department of Ecology and educate them on what it is we're doing, what it would cost for us to implement new technologies to get at parts per billion or parts per trillion of chemicals like PCBs, things that we know are bad, things that in many instances we're not introducing into the marketplace anymore. We've already gotten rid of some of those bad things, but we have legacy issues that we're dealing with. And so what we came to realize in these conversations is that the Clean Water Act isn't the best tool to be dealing with this ongoing problem of water quality standards. We needed a better solution. And after sitting with the governor ultimately had some policy decisions that he needed to make within the Clean Water Act. You'll forgive me, I'm trying not to go into the weeds of human health water quality criteria. There's a bunch of math. I wasn't good at math. And the slides, and going through the slides, ecology, I'd sit with ecology in 4-hour meetings, and they'd have 170 slides in one presentation, and they'd have 2 or 3 presentations that they were making. And I don't think it's beneficial for us to get into the weeds of that. It's more beneficial to look at the process and the results that I think we're getting from it. So when we sat with the governor's office, we made the case that those that are regulated under the Clean Water Act, NPDES permit holders, we often refer to them as point source dischargers. You think of it, the environmental community often shows them as the folks with the big, large smokestacks or a direct pipe going out of their plant into a water body. And that's just not the reality anymore. That's not how it works today. There's so much treatment technology in place that people are already removing most of what they introduce into the environment before it ever leaves their facility. So we made that case to the governor. We said we can continue to tighten the screws on these permitted entities or these permit holders, but we're not going to get the bang for the buck that we're looking for. We're not going to be able to get at that last little molecule of PCBs in our waterways or other pollutants. So we've got to come up with a better solution. So the governor, looking at that work before him, made some policy decisions for the state of Washington within the water quality rule. We're still reviewing that water quality rule. The Department of Ecology has put out a draft rule. They're supposed to go into official rulemaking any day now. Within the next couple of weeks, we expect to see them issue a 102 in the rulemaking process that makes that rule formal. But the reality is when we sat with the governor, we said we have to have that other pathway to get at reducing pollutants in the environment. So we came up with creative solutions to reduce toxics. So now we have a toxics reduction package that the governor's pulled together that, again, we're reviewing that as well. We haven't come out one way or another for that proposal. There's some obstacles and hurdles within that. Todd mentioned it deals with identifying chemicals that are concerning, working through the process of identifying if there's replacements that we could use instead. I was just talking with Steve before the meeting about an opportunity that he's looking into. We know that we can substitute some chemicals to make things better. The question is what is the process to do that? How do we do it? What the governor's proposing is to give ecology authority to mandate this process of review, to potentially, if they deem necessary, ban chemicals from commerce and manufacturing processes. So those are some obstacles that we're going to have to work through and make assessments of and determine whether or not those are things that we can work with and work through that negotiation process. I think what the question is so why does this all matter to you? Why does water quality matter to you? Why does toxics reduction matter to you? I think, A, it's important to know that in the context of the debate that we're currently having on climate change, the governor, as you heard in the session beforehand, if you were in the transportation session, the governor has framed this and others around him has framed this as a moral obligation, and they're using terms like saying polluters must pay. But if you follow what we've done in the water quality work, where we've sat down and we've gone through a science-driven process, and we've said, look, the polluters are paying. Those that had those that were causing the problem in the 1970s, they have paid. They've introduced the technologies. They've reduced their footprint. They're doing things differently. We're now suggesting that we need that same type of path on other policy areas, as Todd suggested, in the environment. So whether that's climate change or toxics reduction in general, we need a science-driven process where we can evaluate what people are doing and allow them to determine what the best path is forward, first allowing them to make those determinations based on their research and development, and do a better job at telling the story of what they're doing. So I see that I'm out of time already, so let me just check quickly. Let me just convey to you a reason that you ought to pay attention to things like toxics reduction and water quality standards. Not many of you probably have to comply with an NPDES permit. Not many of you are manufacturing chemicals or introducing chemicals into a manufacturing process. But we work closely with the Association of Washington Cities, and we worked with the city of Bellingham, and we did an analysis of what it would cost if the governor pursued different paths of answering the water quality rule debate and what policy directives he would give. When we did that analysis and we looked at what Oregon to the south of us had done in their water quality standards, we said if the governor follows an Oregon-like standard, what will that mean to ratepayers, folks like you who pay utility bills to your cities or municipalities through sewer bills? And the answer that we got, if they had to implement that type of technology, would be somewhere in the neighborhood of around $200 per month in addition, new cost to your utility bill for an individual household. That's not for businesses. Businesses would have larger costs because they pay currently larger fees. And the point we made to the governor is for that additional $200 per month per ratepayer in a city like Bellingham, they will implement new technology, and the technology still will not reduce or remove that last molecule of PCB from the environment. So we need creative solutions. We believe the governor heard us. We believe we're cautiously supportive of what the governor has proposed on water quality standards. There's still some obstacles, still some hurdles in that, but we see pathways and an opportunity to move forward. We think that same type of process needs to be used in other environmental discussions and debates. Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, I finally start coming up with some new jokes, and I get yelled at for not telling the old jokes. All right, with that, we will take questions. I'm sure there are many. Who has questions? Yes, back.
This is for Brandon with AWB, and it's not regarding the water issues or water rights, but what is AWB doing this year? I've heard a couple things to counter the governor's cap and trade program that is affecting so many of our local businesses here, and what can we do to help with that?
So this is being rebroadcast, so I'll repeat the question so people who are watching. The question is, what is AWB doing with regard to the governor's cap and trade proposal, and how can people help?
So great question. So it's been tough. The governor's been critical of anyone who criticized his plan because he didn't release a plan until right before the holidays. And we actually got his plan, unfortunately, from a reporter in New York. When he called to ask us questions about the governor's proposal, we said, well, we haven't seen it. And he said, well, I'll email it to you then, because the governor released it to them first. So that was disappointing. So we're still evaluating the proposal. I've already had, since it was released in kind of that late December timeframe, I've had several conference calls with several of our key members. You know, the governor said he's after polluters. Those polluters are employers in this state, first and foremost. They do pay a price on pollution. They implement technologies. They have air operating permits that they have to meet, federal and state regulations. And so we certainly need to reframe the debate, and we're working with our members on doing that. We're working with our members to do the analysis. We're looking at some economic analysis on the governor's proposal. We're reaching out and building a broad stakeholder coalition called Washington Climate Collaborative. Labor unions, public entities are joining with us in that effort. So we're just continuing to do the work. I don't want to be overly critical. I mean, AWB has a long-standing policy that a state cap and trade or state carbon tax, state low carbon fuel standard are not the appropriate tools or policy choices for Washington. There's many reasons we can articulate that. We think a federal approach is a better approach. But we're just continuing to do that work and analysis, and clearly we will be there throughout that debate.
Yeah, as I mentioned, one of the challenges in understanding the governor's legislation is that so much of the decision-making authority about the key issues is delegated to the Department of Ecology. So if you're trying to determine what it actually means and what the costs are, it's almost impossible at this point to do that, because so many of those decisions that we made down the road are going to be the ones that are operative.
Yeah, you can't say that enough. I mean, for the third time just yesterday, I read through the bill front to back, and that was one of my takeaways. Was we're going to take a program, a cap and trade program, and we're going to, with some general guidelines, turn it over to the Department of Ecology and trust that they're going to write rules. And again, I'm appreciative of Ecology and the governor's work on water quality. That was developed through a different process than how the governor's bringing forward a carbon plan, or his proposal there. And so I think the governor, we're inviting the governor to take a step back and come sit with us and work with us on climate like he did on water quality.
All right, next question.
I always enjoy
No, just John's fine.
You actually use the word vacuous. You know, I wonder how many people know what it means or even misspell it. But these stupid arguments, my husband's former boss of Boeing used to say the data will set you free, count on 11, and he used to say to you can't plan any secret. We hear, and this is more rhetorical, but we hear about the big lie, and it strikes me that the variety of outlets we have for communication, the big lie can be repeated very loudly, very frequently, without a whole lot of quality or fact checking behind it. But when can we, as people who do believe in the free market, and I don't know anybody right now except probably Senator Hennifer and the Policy Center, who are articulate, thoughtful, non-polarizing spokespeople who can actually present an argument without people going to their caveman brain. We've never made stupidity and apathy. And how, really rhetorical, how disingenuous is it, especially if you sound, worry about salmon when you eat the bananas?
So I think the fundamental question that you're asking is how do you get people to think differently about environmental policies and articulate more of a free market? Because that voice is so infrequent.
It is, Todd, along with the fact that when are we going to learn, when are you guys, I think we probably need to dig into our pockets today because you've got to spread the word, or we need to ourselves. We need articulate, thoughtful spokesmen.
So there are two key takeaways. The one is the question about how we articulate that, and the second is dig into your pockets to support the Policy Center. So actually, I'll use that as an opportunity to ask John, when you switched from working with the Oregon Environmental Council to Cascade, talk about what it is that changed your mind, what you saw that sort of flipped the switch.
Is that on? Is that working? Yeah, the woman raises a good point about trying to get through to people. And when I got involved with the environmental movement as a kid growing up in New Jersey in the 60s, you know, I was just a kid going on Boy Scout trips and loving the outdoors, and look around North Jersey, it was pretty easy to see a lot of big smokestacks and dead rivers and get disgusted by that. And I think the early environmental activist efforts there, as well as all over the country going back 80 years, 100 years, had genuinely been about cleaning up pollution and cleaning up the ambient environment. But so for me to get a job in the movement in 1977 working for Environmental Defense Fund in New York was an awesome thing. I thought, how could this be better? I'm getting paid to save the world. But fast forward to running the Oregon Environmental Council, by the mid-1990s, to me, those days were over. We had this miraculous cleanup, and the environmental movement was increasingly not about the ambient environment. It was about promoting the environmental bureaucracy and power. Politics and power. Politics is about power. And when you have pension plans for environmental activists, well, you know, they're in it for the long term, and they need a crisis. They always need a crisis. And global warming, my gosh, that's the gift that keeps on giving. And so I got out of that business. It was clear to me it had become completely corrupt, and I had no plan in mind. My parents thought that was really stupid to be, oh, so you have dependents and a mortgage, and you're just leaving and you have no other job. That's great. And I had no thought. I didn't realize I would get hired by the Cascade Policy Institute and to research and write about free market environmentalism. But I look at what goes on now, and I mentioned in my talk about the polystyrene foam ban in Portland. You have 25 years of a policy that is easy to prove empirically that it's backwards, that the policy increases litter, increases solid waste, increases CO2 emissions, if you care about that, which I don't, increases actual pollutants, and they don't care. They've checked it off their list. Evidence doesn't matter. So my view of almost any public policy field, not just environment, is until there's a crisis, until something absolutely is shown to be an epic failure, people just march along accepting it. And so you have windmills all over the place and force-feeding intermittent power into a grid that requires reliability. I believe that's a huge policy dead end that is going to waste billions of dollars. but everyone's on board with it. And then especially, as an earlier speaker said, and Brandon reinforced, when you cleverly convert these when you make it a moral crusade, then obviously if you disagree, you must be immoral. You're a knuckle dragger, Cro-Magnon. And it's a very clever manipulation of the narrative. So I think the work that Brandon does, that Todd does, you have to keep get into the fray. You have to keep a message, but sometimes your message is ahead of its time. There is nothing you can say. Policy stupidity will continue to march on, and then all of a sudden it'll epically fail. And when it finally fails, then you can say, "Hey, I'm still here. I've been saying this a long time. We're still here. We have these solutions." Then your moment arrives.
One of the things I think is that about the free market is that you try to push solutions down to the people who it impacts. When they do surveys, they say, how is the environment, good or bad, nationwide? Do you think it's good or bad? And people say it's bad. And they say, how do you think the environment's doing where you live? And they say, oh, it's good. And the challenge is that when people have less knowledge, they're worried about those unknowns and what's happening. But when they get to look at it themselves, they have a better sense of how things really are. Is the environment clean or unclean? How can I help? Those sorts of things. And by pushing solutions down to local individuals who are involved, right, with the cooperative property rights approach, they don't want to fail, right? Beekeepers don't want to fail, because if they fail, they lose money. But if you ask people who aren't beekeepers, I hear all the time, boy, I hear all the bees are dying, right? It's because they don't have the knowledge, because they don't have the time to get the particular knowledge. So that's why, that's a big reason that local market approaches work better, is because the people who have the most knowledge are the people who are creating the solutions. You had a question, sir.
Yes, question for Mr. Charles. What is your opinion on the environmental and economic efficacy of windmills?
I don't, the question was my opinion of the environmental and economic efficacy of windmills. Well, the wind energy seems to be quite reliant on subsidies. I don't see it as an environmental win when you have to keep backing up the randomly failing windmills with hydropower or coal-fired power or natural gas power or something that you can ramp up. So I've probably spent the last 3 or 4 years trying to ask people who know more than I thought knew more than I did, utility executives, electrical engineers, et cetera, to say, well, what am I missing here? I don't understand. You have a grid that requires reliability, and you're force-feeding volatility and unpredictability into the grid. At some point, that can't work. All these RPS requirements, 20 by 20, 25 by 25, mandates to have so-called green power in the system. It all has to be backed up by this whole duplicative, actually adult system. How can that work? I keep asking people, tell me how it's going to work, and no one ever explains it to me. So I assume it is, in fact, a policy dead end, and at some point, the volatility and the cost and the redundancy issue will become so severe, and ratepayers will begin to rebel, and then we'll have the crisis I talked about, and then maybe we'll actually have an adult conversation. But for now, I mean, you try and bring up downsides to it, you just get crushed. You're just not moral. You're not with the program. I guess you missed the memo, John. The train left the station. Sorry, too late. So that's my response.
All right, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Gary Richardson from Grandview. I'm in the fuel business, so I know a little bit about it, and I just made a couple of comments. But the reason I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of California is because our governor also wants to follow suit with what Governor Brown is trying to do in California. Now, oil company estimates say that it costs in California about 58 cents a gallon more to refine fuel there than it does in Washington or anyplace else. With what Governor Brown wants to do, it very well could increase the cost of fuel between $1.70 and $2.20 a gallon more. Now, if I take that over to Washington, and if Governor Inslee follows suit with what Governor Brown is trying to require, we're looking at $2.20, possibly to $2.70 a gallon more in increase in fuel. The tax revenue source or windfall to the state of California yearly is $63 billion. The reduction in emissions is equivalent to about 53 hours of China's emissions at a cost of $63 billion a year. Business is already mass exiting out of California, if anybody's paying attention, and they are, because it is so expensive to do business in California. Now, you know, one of the things that I find kind of interesting, and we all want clean air and water. Now, when we started building ethanol out of corn, which is a good thing, we started creating additional emissions that nobody anticipated on. And so now what we're doing is we're subsidizing that corn into ethanol production. We're selling a lot of it to Brazil because of the emissions issues created. Then we're bringing Brazilian sugar-based ethanol back into the United States and blending it in to reduce some of the emission issues. Now, of course, we subsidize the ethanol production here.
I'm not going to cut you off, but I do want to get one more question in, so if you could.
So what happens is that ethanol, it gets sold somewhere else in the world. And then when you harvest sugar cane, it's my understanding you torch the fields. Now, you never hear anybody from our government talking about all of the pollution that creates, but that goes full circle. That's what we're looking at.
So, Brandon, do you want to say anything about the low carbon fuel standard? You've been working on a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the numbers. There's a wide range of numbers, right? The governor's done his own analysis on low carbon fuel standards and says 2 to 30 some odd cents. The industry has different numbers, as you referred to, and you're right. I mean, let me just say, low carbon fuel. There's a better way to get at lower intensive carbon fuels than a low carbon fuel standard. And we can incentivize, right? I mean, we can incentivize people to use alternative fuels in the state of Washington. UPS has a massive fleet around the world. They have 0 alternative fuel vehicles in the state of Washington. But they have, I think the number is northwards of 2,000, 2,500 vehicles within their fleet. But the problem is, if you look at a low carbon fuel standard will mandate which fuel you can use at what period of time, and it drives you to that lower intensive carbon fuel. The problem is it doesn't take into account somebody like UPS who uses a variety of different vehicles in their fleets, has a variety of needs within those vehicles, and they're all over the world. So what they've found, and their research says, what works for them in Minneapolis doesn't necessarily work as well for them in San Diego, right? So they want options. They want choices. A low carbon fuel standard picks which fuel will win in the marketplace. It directs you, right? The only way you're really ever going to get to the California standard is all electric vehicles, right? Well, that's choosing electric vehicles. Why not, some of the others like propane or natural gas or some of the other alternatives that are out there, or leave the door open for new technologies to be innovated so that we can bring those to the marketplace. So, I mean, yeah, there's problems with the low carbon fuel standard, including the switch that's happening with sending ours to Brazil and Brazil sending theirs to ours. California has suspended theirs. They have not fully implemented theirs. They keep suspending because they recognize that the fuels aren't available. The technology's not available. And yet Washington wants to follow their path.
Let me just add 2 more quick things about the low carbon fuel standard. When you hear the prices, oftentimes they're talking about prices at the pump. There are 2 prices that you need to consider. One is that the federal government also gives about $1 a gallon subsidy. So the more biofuel we use, the more federal subsidies that we end up paying. And second, biofuel reduces your fuel mileage. EPA estimates, depending, about 10 to 20%. So you're paying, you may be only paying a slight bit more per gallon, but you're having to buy more gallons. So those are additional costs. Fortunately, we're out of time. Thank you very much. Let's thank our 2 speakers.